So this is the continuation from the previous video, which we started with the concept of freedom, and we made two distinctions basically. First between factual and normative freedom, and then within those freedom conceptions of freedom, various other distinctions. And today I want to focus on go a bit deeper on factual freedom, and then I will relate it to the concept of normative freedom. Because in a sense, your conception of factual freedom grounds your conception of normative freedom. To use Kantian terminology, we can say that factual freedom is in fact the condition of the possibility of freedom in the normative sense. Because if your conception of normative freedom is totally at odds with the actual reality, then your normative concept won't have the ontological support which any normative conception needs. Obviously, we are not saying that facts determine your normativity. What we are saying is the facts provide space for multiplicity of normativities, but that space should be there, because if your normativity or your normative conceptions are totally at odds with reality, then they won't have a space to prosper, and you would be in a perpetual fight against reality, and you will be living with an illusion which won't be sustained for long. Okay, so let's start. Now I'm thinking I might need another video, but let's see. It's fine. So factual freedom can be divided into, let's say, I'm using these terms in very broad sense. Natural and then social. And within both of these, we can also distinguish between situation and resources, for example. Situation and resources. So I'm going to look at these from these 4, 5, or 6 perspectives which I've outlined here. Okay, so factual freedom, like factually, first thing which is important is to understand how we are situated in this world as human beings. Our situation. And that can include our being in the world. It can include our capacities. And from both of these, we bring resources, factual resources, which are important for any normative conceptions of freedom. So let's start with our being in the world and capacities, and then go on to resources. I'll try to do the same with the social aspects of it. Okay, so our being in the world. And by our being in the world is, as individuals, how do we find ourselves in the world? How do we find ourselves in the world? How do we find ourselves in the world? And this question relates to our situation, and it affects our capacities as well. So, for example, just to I didn't choose my place of birth. I didn't choose my time of birth. So these are limitations, or these are conditions with which I was born, and I can't change them. I mean, there are certain part of my situation which I can change. Yeah, well, that's where resources come. But these I can't change. So similarly, I can't change my. I mean, so far not anyway. They're trying to biological. Of course, our biology evolves over time, and a lot of it is social, so I'm not denying that, but there is something there which we can't change, our DNA or our genetic heritage. um, there's a huge debate on nature versus nurture. I don't want to go into that, and I'm not taking any position in here, so my argument can follow without taking side in nature versus nurture debate. So I haven't chosen which country I was supposed to be born in. Of course, in some cases I can change those countries, but the fact that I was born in that country can't be changed. Sometime it won't have any significance for my freedom, but some other time it might. Can't change the religion and culture I was born into. I can change some of them. We can change. So customs comes in it more. Is the whole social. But it's not easy to change, and even when you think that you have changed, doesn't mean that you have actually changed, because these things can be deep. And I'm talking about just the way we find ourselves in this world. So I haven't even touched on the question of socialization, which deepens certain things, makes certain things more likely and certain other things unlikely. And within these things, you can, capacities as well. We obviously can develop our capacities, but certain capacities are, some people are practically gifted, some other people are more theoretically gifted. Some people are good with numbers, some are not. And obviously we can work hard to change that, but obviously the one who is already good with numbers, it's hard to compete with someone who has a big problem with numbers, etc. So capacities and all those things, some of them we can change, but there are a lot of others we can't change. And this is before socialization, because as we will see with socialization, certain capacities, which are just capacities, just facts, are given normative advantage over others, and that depends on the civilization and its overall direction. So this was so being in the world. This was a bit about us, how we find ourselves in the world. Then we are given certain resources which are important for our self-development and the possibility of normative freedom. So those are senses, understanding, reason, experience. So we are looking at them at this point as natural capacities, but they would be socially groomed, and they would have social meaning beyond natural capacities as well. Then you have material resources. Some people are poor, some are rich, starting point. Obviously, we can overcome certain limitations. We are flying nowadays, but then there are certain limitations. It seems like, people have tried, and I don't want to make any predictions, but it seems that, for example, as individuals, we can't seem to overcome our death, for example. So that's a huge limitations on human freedom, both factual as well as normative freedom. So this is the factual part of our freedom. So now let us get to the social part. So as I said, factual freedom can be divided into natural and social, and we sort of covered natural freedom a bit, but let us move on to social, because all those things are developed within social institutions, social units, social settings. All my natural resources, natural situatedness, natural capacities. As I grow in a society, and they all take social meaning, which is in addition to natural meaning. And socialization as a process, is very important, because through socialization as a process, I develop as an individual. So this seems paradoxical, but that's actually correct, because socialization as a process, that's how I develop as an individual. That's how I understand my natural situatedness. In a sense, that's how I understand my capacities. That's how I understand my resources. And as an individual, I've always a capacity to switch from one society to another, or to not accept certain part of my socialization or try to transcend them. But generally, for most people, socialization is, in a sense, binding. Not in a deterministic sense, but that's how people grow up, and they don't find it as contrary to their individuality. That's how they understand their individuality through socialization. And going against the current and going against the mores and custom is part of that process of socialization itself. But nobody can transcend socialization as such, as long as we are human beings, and as long as we are the being of the type we are. Different people are determined or shaped differently by these socialization, and that's where our individuality shines. Our differences shine. So socialization doesn't mean that we don't have individual freedom, because without it, socialization itself sort of presupposes that within that individual freedom, socialization shape our individuality, shape our desires, our inspirations, our worldview, etc. And this socialization occurs through or within social institutions. So the most important of them is family. And the role of family changes in different historical configuration, but the role is there. Number two, education system. And by that I don't mean just the school and universities or institution, but I also mean, a whole set of social interactions with our relatives, with our friends, with our enemies, with our buddies, with our opponents. This, educate us and make us who we are. And it is, and nowadays obviously you have, state, and you have other market, and all these institutions within which we are socialized, we are individualized, we become individuals. Okay. So, and it is within this socialization that we understand anew ontological situatedness, our capacities, our resources, and how to use them, and when to use them, and what are their limits, and what are their possibilities, etc. This is understood within this process of socialization. So in a sense, there are not totally, so when we talk about natural things, it's sort of an abstraction in a sense, because we are talking about nature, so-called natural things, which we understand within the context of the. So, for example, we might have some natural desires, for example, natural desires. Obviously, there are some absolute needs which are, we won't exist as biological entity if we don't fulfill those needs. But beyond those needs, any natural desires are socially understood and socially valued. So, for example, socialization may create certain desires. Which, if people were left on their own, or they were different set of socialization, might not have risen. For example, people might think that they are natural desire, but they are not natural desire. They are socially constructed and socially determined desires in us. And even if there are certain natural desires, and as long as they are not absolute biological needs, just because they are so-called natural desire, doesn't mean that I will necessarily desire them. But there are a lot of desires which are potentially available to me. But just because they are available doesn't mean that I'll desire them. And whether I desire certain things and don't desire certain other things will crucially depend on my socialization and the values which are created and adopted through that socialization. So the main thing or main lesson of this whole rambling is that just because certain desires are available naturally or even socially doesn't mean that one would necessarily desire those desires. So, and that is important because although everything we do has natural foundation to it, when it comes to desires, and by desires I mean any needs which are beyond our absolute biological needs, socialization in many ways is decisive. Okay, now what does this tells us about normative freedom then? And I'll try to finish with that, and probably I'll take another video to just sum this up. And normative freedom in both these senses, negative freedom and positive freedom. So just because I have a desire to smoke, for example, doesn't mean that I want to smoke. So I might be negatively free that nobody is stopping me from desiring this desire. Positively, I don't take an action. And this will also impact your sense of whether you are free or not. So, for example, you are in a society in which certain desires are prohibited. So, in value terms, you are not supposed to or allowed to desire those desires. And for sure, you are not allowed to actually positively exercise your freedom to enjoy those desires, in such a society you will feel unfree, depending on the level of determination. You feel that your freedoms have been curtailed. You might feel suffocated in that environment. But on the other hand, in the same environment, there's another person who doesn't have that desire that you have. They won't feel unfreedom that you are feeling. And it's not the question of just feeling, it's the question of the interaction between your individual desires and social ideals. And if you are not, these two things are at odd, then you will feel or not feel free or unfree accordingly. So that dialectic is very important. Okay, I think I'll stop here and I'll make a short video, the third one, to just sum it up and relate it to capitalism, because that's where my real interest lies in how this relate to capitalistic desires and whether they are natural desires or they are created through socialization or whatnot. Okay, so I'll see you